your okay. Okie dokie. Okay, let's continue with where we were. Because I'm happy. Not you, but you. Okay. Mm. Mm. Okay. So where do I begin? It's good to start from, okay, this close. Yes. Close this tab. Okay. Last time I was here. Woo. Oh, the people are laughing outside. How are you and what do you do? I am good, thanks, and you. How are you? How is your Tuesday? Today's a happy day. I'm already clumsy. I haven't started yet. Okay, so I'm going to read. Oh, first I'm going to read the like a brief. It's not an article. These are just notes that I made because I didn't understand what is API, those concepts. So I made notes here in my tablet. Where are my notes? Not here. Where's Word? It's here. What do you do? I am doing well. Oh, yeah. Here, I wrote here in this tablet. I wrote notes here. I will read everything, like 14 pages, you see. I'm going to read everything here. First, I'm going to start with, okay, my thesis, okay, where my thesis or what inspired my thesis proposal. So this is where the legal argument becomes interesting, because the South African Reserve Bank is not saying that cross-border interoperability is unimportant. Rather, it is saying this consultation paper is not dealing with it. So this is the consultation paper that was published when last year. This is what my supervisor actually sent to me. He said, you must read this consultation paper. I read some parts of it, not everything. So, but one thing I know for a fact is that in the consultation paper, the discussion of cross-border interoperability is excluded. Let me go back just for clarity. Draft consultation paper. Yes, this is the one. Consultation paper on interoperability in the National Payment System 2025. You don't have to read everything, you know. I'm just going to go to the purpose or the scope. Or I can read chapter 5, what is interoperability? Okay, we will get to this later. So the most interesting part, first the scope. Yeah, do people love reading? Reading is fun if it's fiction. It's fun if it's fiction, but if it's anything not fiction related, it's like, why? Okay, the scope reads as follows. This consultation paper covers the interoperability of domestic payment systems, infrastructure, schemes, and products or applications within the national payment system. This extends to both the closed loop and open loop payment system. So it's more focused on like domestic interoperability. So interoperability of cross-border payment system is excluded from the scope of this consultation paper. Yes. And then this is the most interesting part. Why did they exclude the cross-border interoperability? Okay, so this is where the legal argument becomes interesting, because the South African Reserve Bank is not saying that cross-border interoperability is unimportant, right? Rather, it is saying this consultation paper is not dealing with it. So this is a subtle but important distinction. Very important to distinguish between the two statements. From India. Hi, hello. You know, yesterday my housemate bought like I forgot the name. It's like this yellow curry. Yellow, like the color is yellow. Like she bought it from an Indian restaurant. She made me taste it. It was actually good. Indian are very good when it comes to curry or like this soup, like this soup things. Very, very good. Yellow, but then like with chicken. With chicken, it was good. So step one, what problem is the South African Reserve Bank trying to solve? Remember, in my introduction, I said this. I said that the South African Reserve Bank has, over the past decade, should I remove the decade and write over the past years, because it's just been like since 20, I think I wrote here, since 2006, right? The concept of interoperability was first raised in 2006. I don't know, I'm gonna leave it like that. The South African Reserve Bank has over the past decade committed to enhancement of interoperability in the national payment system. Yes. So just interoperability. I haven't said anything about cross-border interoperability. This commitment was reflected in the publication of the position paper on interoperability, which supported payment systems that give preference to general accepted international standards as opposed to proprietary standards, and payment systems that conform to uniform and open standards that lay the foundation for interoperability between payment products and systems. So the commitment again to enhance interoperability in the national payment system was further reinforced in the National Payment System Framework and Strategy Vision 2025, which identified interoperability as a strategic priority aimed at improving communication and interoperability between payment systems to prevent fragmentation and promote a more harmonized and competitive payment ecosystem. So, more recently, which is this consultation paper, more recently, the South African Reserve Bank published a consultation paper on interoperability in the national payment system, which aims to promote the achievement of interoperability envisioned in Vision 2025. So Vision 2025, the goal there was to improve interoperability, right? Because they believe that by doing so, it will prevent payments, or it will prevent fragmentation within the payment systems and promote a more harmonized and competitive payment ecosystem. Has that goal been achieved? No. But then yet the consultation paper underscores that like its aim is to promote the achievement of interoperability envisioned in Vision 2025, thus enabling a more interoperable, efficient, inclusive, and competitive national payment system. The question is like, how can we even have this kind of discussion if the consultation paper itself excludes cross-border interoperability? Significantly, however, the said consultation paper, like I said, yes, expressly excludes cross-border payment interoperability from its scope. So this exclusion raises an important legal question as to whether South African financial law or infrastructure currently establishes enforceable legal principles governing cross-border payment interoperability within the national payment system. You don't just exclude things. You don't. Okay, next is just the definition of interoperability. Okay, let me read this summary here. So what problem is the South African Reserve Bank trying to solve? The consultation paper observes that many payment service providers, the PSPs, and banks communicate using APIs. The consultation paper observes that many payment service providers and banks communicate using, especially in South Africa, proprietary APIs, non-standardized payment messages, and different technical standards. So what does this mean? This means that in simple terms. So imagine we have 5 banks, each speaking a different language. Bank A speaks English, Bank B speaks French, Bank C speaks German, Bank D speaks Spanish, Bank E speaks Portuguese. If a fintech wants to connect to all 5 banks, it must learn 5 different languages. That is expensive, that is inefficient, that discourages competition. Exactly. Am I supposed to put this here? Let me tell you something about writing academic work. You have an idea, but sometimes like putting it in words can be a little bit challenging, you know? It's not that easy. It's not. It's really not. It's full of shit, a little bit of law. I'm joking. I do love law, but only academics, nothing beyond academia. Okay. Okay. I wrote it that more recently, the Stockholm Reserve Bank published a consultation paper on interoperability, right, in the national payment system, which aims to promote the achievement of interoperability envisioned in Vision 2025, thus enabling more interoperable, efficient, inclusive, and competitive. Oh my God! You know what this means? It means that I have to read the National Payment System Framework and Strategy Vision 2025 and see, but then the goals are here. The goals are here and clear, which were to improve the payment systems, so as to prevent fragmentation and promote a more harmonized and competitive payment system. Mm. Okay, so the consultation paper, of course, yes, expressly excludes cross-border payment interoperability from its scope. That's clear. And then this exclusion, of course, raises an important legal question as to whether South African financial law currently establishes enforceable legal principles governing cross-border payment interoperability within the national payment system. Okay. So what problem is the South African Reserve Bank trying to solve? The consultation paper observes that many payment service providers and banks communicate using proprietary APIs, non-standardized payment messages, and different technical standards. That is the current position. In simple terms, imagine 5 banks, each speaking, okay, yes, we have 5 banks, each speaking a different language. We have, okay, Bank A speaks English, Bank B speaks French, Bank C speaks German, Bank D speaks Spanish, Bank E speaks Portuguese. If a fintech wants to connect to all 5 banks, it must learn, oh, India people. India people. Yes, Indians are very smart. You know, today I saw like this video. It's quite a funny video. So this mother was basically introducing like her son. She's like, the mother is Chinese. She's like, I am Chinese, and the father of my son is Indian. And the comment section was very, very interesting. It was very fun. People that were like, yeah, this child is already a lawyer, an engineer, uh, what do we call, like all those careers. They just listed all. They say like this child is already like, you know, the STEM. It's like they were just saying everything positive or something like beyond genius. They were describing a child as like a genius, like an impossible child, which is can be true because Indians are very smart. Like Indians, Chinese, very smart people. They are very smart. I'm not gonna lie. Very smart. Is it? Smart people. Okay. We have no. Wait. Oh. 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 I needed to check something, right? When you write like a research, right? When you write a research proposal, what must you take into consideration? I need the facts. A research proposal. What must you take into consideration? Okay. So, when writing a research proposal, you should take several important factors into consideration. First, research topic and problem. The problem, okay? The problem. So, you have to clearly identify what you want to study. Explain the problem or gap in existing knowledge. Make sure the topic is relevant and worth investigating. Research objectives. Okay, the problem now here is this exclusion raises an important legal question as to whether South Africa's financial law currently establishes enforceable legal principles governing cross-border payment interoperability within the national payment system. We don't know this. We don't know. I do not know either. But I do know the answer is no. As of now, there aren't enforceable legal principles governing cross-border within the national payment system in South Africa. Maybe there isn't. There isn't. But then when you write a research proposal, you don't answer the problem. You state the problem. So now I have to pretend as if I don't know. But I do know. Okay. 24 minutes, that's good. Okay, moving forward. If a fintech wants to connect to all 5 banks, it must learn 5 different languages. Yes, that is expensive, that is inefficient, that discourages competition. Okay. Okay. So we need common standards. If everyone speaks the same language, it becomes much easier for payment systems to communicate. Okay. Now, before we go into in the context. So, what is interoperability? The South African Reserve Bank describes interoperability as the capacity of payment service providers and payment system participants to transact across different platforms and networks in a manner that promotes efficiency, accessibility, innovation, and competition. Similarly, the Committee on Payments and Market Infrastructures regards interoperability as the compatibility of payment systems that enables participants to clear and settle transactions efficiently across different infrastructures. Consequently, interoperability is not merely a technical characteristic of payment systems, but it may also operate as a regulatory mechanism capable of determining who may access financial infrastructure and on what legal terms. So this perspective is reflected in the regulatory approaches adopted by the European Union, EU, the United Kingdom, like a regulatory mechanism, from which this study draws lessons for the regulation of cross-border payment interoperability and access to payment system infrastructure within the South African national payment system. Okay. What is the legal significance of interoperability? The legal significance of interoperability, particularly in the cross-border context, has become I remember this argument when I was reading the which one? The legal significance. Oh my god, I read this somewhere. The legal significance of interoperability, particularly in the cross-border context, has become increasingly apparent with the digitalization of financial service. I remember I read this somewhere. I remember vividly. I read this somewhere. Oh my god. But you know, when you add more references, right? It changes the footnotes. And you have to restart everything, like the footnotes. So modern financial systems are increasingly digital and platform-based. Yes, I remember also this one. Nevertheless, even the most technologically advanced okay, wait, I have to find that information because I remember I read that information yesterday, but I don't recall from which position paper. It was not from the consultation paper. It was probably from Vision 2025. It has to be from National Payment System and Framework Strategy. Let me see. Oh, this is 2010. The national, oh, not 2010. It can't be. It has to be 20. The national payment 20. This one. It has to be this. Oh. It has to be this one. I read this somewhere. Cost effectiveness. What on the page? Here. Yes, I remember. I remember. I remember here when I read about interoperability. I remember this. What page is this? Page 16. Okay. It reads interoperability, improved communication and interoperability between payment systems will help in preventing fragmentation and lead to a more harmonized and competitive payment ecosystem. So interoperability continues to be an important policy objective for the South African national payment system. Interoperability prevents fragmentation, multiple, disparate payment systems, providing similar payment offerings where such offerings are available only to a select set of customers. As mentioned in Vision 2010, interoperability, of course, refers to the ease of interlinking different systems on a business as well as a technology level. Achieving this requires collaboration between payment system participants as well as contributions from all levels of the value chain: regulators, system operators, banks, non-bank payment providers, and end users. The application of new technologies has re-emphasized the need for the adoption of open and globally endorsed standards to enable interoperability. Adherence to global and regional and domestic standards is a key enabler of interoperability. Payment systems are constantly evolving and changing, and the need for communication and interoperability between systems is growing. Exactly. End users should be able to initiate payments using the instruments and channels most convenient to them, and these payments should be able to be received via multiple channels in a cost-effective manner. Having common standards helps to lower fragmentation across payment systems, thereby leading to a more harmonized and competitive payment ecosystem. So the proliferation of closed-loop domestic remittance networks in South Africa used by consumers, particularly the unbanked and underbanked, to send and receive payments is one manifestation of the lack of interoperability. The current fragmented environment of closed-loop remittance systems hinders consumer choice, as they are either forced to receive funds using a remittance network chosen by the sender or have limited availability of networks in their area. Promoting interoperability will enable the consumers across South Africa to send and receive funds using the most convenient and most affordable remittance method available. Who's sending me a message? as well. I need to put this one. It's page 16, eh? Page 16. So what is that called? The framework. So the Reserve Bank, this is 2025. National Payment Department, no consultation paper. On the framework is N4, Vision 2025. So it's Vision 2025 16. Wait. N4 16. N4 16. Where was I? It's 9 and 10. The legal significance of interoperability, particularly in the cross-border context. Modern financial is increasingly digital. Okay, I think I can move this one. Okay, fine. So, nevertheless, even the most technologically advanced international payment platforms remain dependent upon domestic banking system for settlement, clearing, liquidity management, and currency conversion. A practical illustration is provided by PayPal. In South Africa, PayPal users wishing to withdraw funds into a South African bank account must utilize the withdrawal service administered by First National Bank, which is FNB. Even where a customer does not bank with FNB, that customer must create an FNB online banking profile to facilitate the withdrawal of PayPal funds into a South African bank account. So this arrangement illustrates the extent to which cross-border payment platforms may remain dependent on regulated domestic payment institutions for access to the national payment system and its underlying infrastructure. It also underscores the importance of examining whether South African law adequately regulates cross-border payment interoperability and access to payment system infrastructure. The PayPal example also raises questions concerning the extent to which the South African Reserve Bank's stated objectives regarding interoperability have been realized in the context of cross-border payments. Okay, so the question remains, okay, okay, so the question remains whether the exclusion of cross-border payment payment interoperability. Okay, let's see this one. So the question remains whether the exclusion of cross-border payment interoperability from the consultation paper from the scope of consultation paper the question remains whether the exclusion of cross-border payment interoperability from the scope of the consultation paper mean that the preferential law currently establishes. Okay, I need to do this. Okay. Cappuccino. Is it coffee or me? Cappuccino. So the question remains whether the exclusion of cross-border payment interoperability from the scope of the consultation paper means that South African financial law currently establishes enforceable legal principles governing cross-border payment interoperability within the national payment system. So the consultation paper excludes cross-border, but the South African law nevertheless contains enforceable governing it. The legal question, therefore, remains whether, notwithstanding the exclusion of the cross-border payment the scope of the paper, South African financial law currently So the consultation. So the paper example also raises questions concerning the extent to which the South African Reserve Bank stated objectives regarding interoperability have been realized in the context of cross-border payments. Let's do this. So, okay, the consultation paper excludes cross-border interoperability. Cross-border interoperability, but the South African law nevertheless contain enforceable by the South African law, in particular the national payment system contain enforceable legal principles governing the cross-border payment interoperability. Okay, so as underscored in the position paper, the objective was to support payment systems that give preference to generally accepted international standards over proprietary standards. Yet, where access to domestic payment infrastructure for cross-border payment platforms is dependent upon a particular domestic banking institution and its associated arrangement, similar to the above paper illustration, questions arise regarding the practical and legal implication of such dependence for interoperability, competition, and access to yes, I think it does make sense, but you will be careful about what it is actually saying. If a cross-border payment platform wants to connect to South African payment infrastructure, but in practice it has to go through a particular South African bank, then that dependence creates legal question. So, yet where access to domestic payment infrastructure for cross-border payment platform is dependent upon a particular domestic banking institution and its associated arrangements, similar to the above paper illustration, question arises regarding the practical and legal implication of such dependence for interoperability, competition, and access to the national payment system. Similarly, Vision 2025 identified enhanced interoperability as a means of improving communication between payment systems, preventing fragmentation or market, and promoting a more harmonized and competitive payment ecosystem. So the exclusion of cross-border payment interoperability from the scope of the consultation paper therefore raises a further question as to whether the interoperability objective contemplated in Vision 2025 extend or were intended to extend to cross-border payment systems and service providers. Against this background, this thesis examines whether South African financial law establishes enforceable legal principles governing cross-border payment interoperability within the national payment system. Specifically, it investigates whether the existing legal frameworks, including the National Payment System Act and related financial sector legislation, adequately regulates cross-border payment interoperability and the participation of cross-border payment service providers in the national payment systems. The thesis further examines the extent to which such participation is dependent upon intermediary banking. Yes, intermediary banking institutions and legal arrangements governing access to domestic payment infrastructure. So, in addressing this question, the thesis evaluates whether the existing South African legal framework sufficiently promotes the objectives of interoperability, competition, accessibility, and financial inclusion in the cross-border payments context. It also considers whether current framework creates legal uncertainty concerning the rights, obligations, and conditions applicable to cross-border payment service providers seeking to interact with or access the national payment system. Finally, okay, let me do this. Oh no. Okay, finally, the thesis draws lessons from the regulator approaches adopted in the EU, the UK, and Singapore to evaluate whether elements of these frameworks may inform the future development of South African financial law and contribute to a more coherent regulatory framework for cross-border payment interoperability. How many minutes? 52. 1 hour left and I'm finished. Okay, what is an AP? Yeah, this is good. Before we go to number 2. Number 2, lessons from the EU. We have lessons from the EU, the UK, and Singapore. In Singapore, on the regulation of cross-border payment interoperability and access to payment system infrastructure. And access to payment system infrastructure. So this section examines the above mentioned jurisdictions to identify lessons that may inform the regulation of cross-border payment interoperability and access to payment system infrastructure in South Africa. So like payment system infrastructure or access to the national payment system, which one? Okay, let me see. Which one do I say? Okay, choose one. Choose one. I'll do this when I edit. Choose one. Payment system infrastructure. Payment system infrastructure, or simply versus the national payment system, or just state the national payment system. So it considers the EU directive regime, the UK Open Banking Initiative, the Singapore's Payment Service Act. So these jurisdictions have adopted different regulatory approaches to interoperability, access, and participation within their respective payment systems. Examining these approaches provides a basis for considering whether and to what extent elements of this regulatory framework may offer lessons for addressing the legal framework governing cross-border payment, interoperability, and access to payment system infrastructure within the South African national payment system. But to understand this, or to, oh my god, I have to wait. And B, check the footnotes again and again and again. First, let's read what is API. What is an API in this context? An API, which is application programming interface, is simply a set of rules that allows one computer system to communicate with another. For example, imagine ordering food. You don't walk into the kitchen, do you? Of course not. You give your order to the waiter, and the waiter carries the order to the kitchen, and the kitchen sends the food back through the waiter. So the waiter is like an API. Exactly. Similarly, so for example, we have PayPal, we have API, we have bank, we have customer. So I am a customer. My bank account, or I bank with Capitec, and if I want to withdraw money from PayPal, what do? The necessary bank here is FNB. Capitec is irrelevant. So I'm going to be the customer, and the bank that I use is FNB, and FNB with its own proprietary API communicates with PayPal, and PayPal with its own API communicates back to FNB, and FNB comes back to me. So the API allows the system to exchange information securely. So what does proprietary API mean? A proprietary API belongs to one institution. Belongs to one institution. It belongs, wait. Oh, so this will fall under this part. Okay, fine. Suppose FNB creates its own API. Standard Bank creates a different API. ABSA creates another. NetBank another. Capitec another. Now a fintech must build one connection for FNB, another for Standard Bank, another for ABSA, another for NetBank, another for Capitec. So the South African Reserve Bank says this creates unnecessary barriers. So what does standardized API mean? Instead, imagine every bank agrees, right? Not in South Africa. How many minutes? 60. Good. So here, step 4. What does standardized API mean? Instead, imagine every bank agrees we will all use exactly the same interface. Now a fintech builds one connection. That one connection works with every bank. That is interoperability. Mm. Mm. That is interoperability. Okay. Okay, so now 1 hour. Oh my God. Now, where does your thesis begin? Now comes the important part. The South African Bank says, no, the South African Reserve Bank says, proprietary APIs create barriers, and that is a fact. They do. They do. So, proprietary APIs create barriers. It also says standardization promotes interoperability. So far, so good. But then the consultation paper says we are only discussing interoperability within South Africa. It expressly excludes cross-border interoperability. Why does that matter? Suppose PayPal wants to connect to the South African bank. That is not simply a domestic interoperability issue. It is a cross-border interoperability issue. Now ask question. Does the consultation paper tell us how PayPal should connect? No. Does it establish legal rights? No. Does it establish duties? No. Does it explain who must give PayPal access? No. It deliberately leaves those questions outside its scope. That is where, okay, many people stop there, right? Instead, if the consultation paper does not deal with cross-border interoperability, where do we find the law? Does the National Payment System Act answer it? Does the Banks Act? Does the Financial Sector Regulation Act? Does the Exchange Control? Does the South African Reserve Bank's directives? Or nowhere? We don't know. So this is a legal gap, right? Notice something important. A technical problem is APIs don't work together. A legal problem is who has a legal right to connect? That's a very good question. Those are completely different questions. The consultation paper mainly addresses the first, your thesis. Okay. So now the PayPal example. This is why your PayPal example, okay. Imagine PayPal says, I want South African customers to receive money. PayPal cannot simply plug itself into the national payment system. Instead, it relies on FNB. Why? Because FNB provides the regulated banking infrastructure through which PayPal withdrawals are processed into South African bank accounts. So now the question is that because the law requires it, or because private contracts require it, or because there is no legal mechanism That is exactly. So now let's talk about the EU. The European Union becomes relevant. Now compare that with PSD2, right? PSD2 says banks must provide access to licensed third-party providers. That is a legal obligation. In South Africa, does the National Payment System Act, the National Payment System Act, contain an equivalent rule? Maybe not. So the legal issue, I think, so I think there is one sentence that captures it entirely. Okay. The South African Reserve Bank consultation paper identifies the technical barriers to interoperability, but deliberately excludes the legal regulation of cross-border interoperability from its scope, right? This raises the question whether South African financial law otherwise provides a legal framework governing the participation of cross-border payment service providers in the national payment system, or whether a regulatory gap exists. So, technical interoperability and legal interoperability, they are two distinct, they are two different concepts. Oh, now we are here. PSD2. Payment System Direct or Payment Services Directive. Once you understand its purpose, writing the full thesis becomes much easier. So you think of your thesis as one big question asks, right? That's a very good question. Now imagine someone asks you, how do you know what adequate looks like? You cannot simply say or simply answer, I think it isn't adequate. You need benchmark. Okay. Okay. Now we have the PSD2 regime in the EU, right? The PSD2 regime provides a relevant example of a regulatory framework that establishes legal mechanisms governing third-party access to payment account services and payment initiation. It provides a relevant example of a regulatory framework that establishes legal mechanisms governing third-party access to payment account services and payment initiation. Okay, so it is not trying to prove that Europe, the UK, and Singapore have better laws. It is asking, how have other jurisdictions legally dealt with similar problems? Those answers become lessons, not models that South Africa must copy. Let's start with the EU. What problem was the EU trying to solve? Banks controlled customers' payment accounts. Fintechs couldn't easily interact with banks. So banks could simply say no or use your own system. So the EU said no, the law itself will decide. So PSD2 created legal rights. So provides a relevant example of a regulatory framework that establishes legal mechanisms governing third-party access to payment account services and payment initiation. PSD2 builds on the 2007 Payment Services Directive and expands the regulatory framework applicable to payment services within the EU, including through provisions governing payment initiation services, account information services, and the secure access of third-party providers to payment accounts. So these provisions are relevant to the South African context because they demonstrate how legislation may regulate the interaction between payment service providers through legally defined access requirements. Exactly. Then we have Articles 66 and 67, third-party access to payment account services. So, Articles 66 and 67 of PSD2 establish a legal framework for third-party access to payment account services. Articles 66 and 67 of PSD2 establishes a legal framework for third-party access to payment account services. Article 66 regulates payment initiation services and requires payment account payment service providers to allow payment initiation service providers to provide their services in accordance with the conditions prescribed by the directive. Article 67 similarly regulates account information services and provides for access to payment account information by account information service providers subject to the conditions established by PSD2. The provisions therefore establish a statutory framework governing the interaction between ASPSPs and authorized or registered third-party providers rather than leaving such interaction solely to contractual arrangement between parties. And then we have third-party providers, authorization and access. Third-party providers, right? Authorization. So PSD2 further established a regulatory framework for entities providing payment initiation services and account information services. Payment initiation services providers and account information service providers are subject to authorization or registration requirements under the directive depending on the nature of the services provided. The framework establishes a regulated pathway through which non-bank entities may provide specified payment services and interact with payment account servicing providers, subject to applicable regulatory requirements. The PSD2 framework therefore demonstrates how legislation may facilitate third-party participation by defining legal status of providers, prescribing conditions applicable to their activities, and establishing regulatory oversight of the interaction with payment account servicing providers. For South Africa, the relevant lesson is to not necessarily that the PSD2 model should adopt in its entirety, but rather that a statutory framework may provide greater legal certainty concerning the participation of non-bank providers and the conditions under which they may interact with established payment service providers. So, the PSD2 framework consequently provides a useful reference point for assessing the South African legal position. In particular, it raises the question of whether the South African legal framework provides sufficiently clear and enforceable legal mechanisms governing the participation of third-party and cross-border payment service providers and their ability to interact with domestic payment infrastructure. It further provides a basis for considering whether legal requirements concerning access, technical interoperability, and regulatory oversight could contribute to addressing the integration barriers associated with proprietary APIs and non-standardized payment interfaces identified by the South African Reserve Bank. So we have lessons for South Africa here. The significance of this framework for South Africa, for the South African context, lies in the manner in which it legally structures third-party participation in the payment services. This is particularly relevant in light of the South African Reserve Bank observation that proprietary APIs and non-standardized payment messages may restrict third parties from integrating the system with those of banks and may create difficulties for third parties seeking to connect to multiple banks. PSD2 provides a regulatory example of how legislation may establish defined conditions for third-party access and interaction with payment account servicing providers, while simultaneously subjecting such access to regulatory requirements. And then we have the UK Open Banking and Cross-Border Payment Interoperability. The UK Open Banking Initiative provides a distinct regulatory approach to facilitating interoperability and access within the payment service sector. Unlike PSD2, which establishes a harmonized legislative framework for payment services across the EU, the UK Open Banking Initiative originated primarily as a competition intervention addressing the market position of incumbent banks. The initiative demonstrates how competition law and regulatory intervention may be used to address barriers to competition arising from limited access to customer permission, financial data, and absence of standardized mechanisms through which third-party providers can interact with incumbent banks. Well, the CMA may order and mandatory data sharing. So the CMA identified a number of competition concerns in the UK retail banking sector, including limited consumer engagement and switching, information asymmetries, and the concentration of market power among incumbent banks. In response, the CMA required the largest retail banks to implement open banking measures, including the development of standardized APIs through which authorized third-party providers could access customer permission data and initiate payments. The UK open banking framework is significant because it demonstrates how standardization and mandatory data sharing requirements may be used to address barriers to competition and facilitate interaction between incumbent banks and third-party providers, rather than leaving technical and legal arrangements governing access entirely to individual contractual negotiation. The CMA intervention established a common framework through which participating banks and authorized third-party providers could interact using standardized technical interfaces. This approach is particularly relevant to the South African context in light of the South African Reserve Bank's observation that proprietary APIs and unstandardized payment messages create difficulties for third-party providers seeking to integrate with multiple banks and constitute barriers to the achievement of technical interoperability. So the UK experience therefore provides a basis for considering whether regulatory intervention aimed at standardizing interfaces and establishing common access arrangements could contribute to addressing similar interoperability barriers within the South African national payment system. Then we have the regulatory enforcement and governance. The implementation of UK open banking was supported by a dedicated governance and implementation structure. The Open Banking Implementation Entity, which is OBI, was established by the CMA's requirements to develop and maintain technical standards, specifications, and governance arrangements necessary to implement the open banking framework. The establishment of a dedicated implementation structure illustrates the importance of institutional arrangements in translating legal and regulatory requirements concerning access and interoperability into operational and technical standards. The UK model therefore offers a further lesson for South Africa. Achieving interoperability may require not only legal obligations concerning access and data sharing, but also appropriate technical standards and institutional mechanisms to facilitate their implementation and oversight. In the context of the South African national payment system, this raises the question of whether the existing regulatory framework provides sufficient mechanisms to address the technical and legal barriers to interoperability identified in the South African Reserve Bank, particularly those arising from proprietary APIs and non-standardized payment messages. And then lastly, we have Singapore, which is the PSA, the Payment System Act, Payment Services Act, Payment Services or Payment System Act. The PSA establishes a regulatory framework for a range of payment services, including account issuance, domestic money transfer, cross-border money transfer, and digital payment token services. PSA adopts a risk-based licensing framework under which payment service providers may be required to obtain a standard payment institution license, a major payment institution license, a money changing license, depending on the nature and scale of the services provided. The framework subjects payment services providers to regulatory requirements that address, among other matters, operational risk, safeguarding of customer funds, and other risks associated with the provision of payment services. So, moving further, we have the PSA and cross-border payment services. The PSA is relevant to the South African context because it expressly includes cross-border money transfer services within the regulated payment services framework. Providers of regulated payment services are subject to licensing and regulatory requirements administered by the Money Authority of Singapore, with the applicable regulatory obligations reflecting the nature and scale of the services provided. The framework therefore provides a statutory basis for regulatory entities that provide cross-border payment services and subject their activities to regulatory oversight within a unified payment services regime. Although the PSA does not establish an express statutory right of access to payment infrastructure comparable to the third-party access provisions under PSD2, its treatment of cross-border money transfer services provides a relevant point of reference for South Africa. In particular, it demonstrates the potential value of expressly recognizing cross-border payment services within a statutory framework and establishing clear requirements governing the authorization and supervision of providers operating in this area. Exactly. For the purposes of the South African context, the Singapore framework therefore raises the question of whether the existing legal framework sufficiently addresses the position of cross-border payment services providers and clearly defines the legal and regulatory conditions under which such providers may participate in or interact with the domestic payment system. While Singapore's PSA does not expressly mandate open API access akin to PSD2, its structured licensing framework and regulatory expectations encourage interoperability where necessary to ensure competing payment services can connect to Singapore's payment infrastructure. Regulatory guidelines specify operational risk controls, consumer authentication, transaction limits, and safeguarding of clients' funds. So the PSA thus incorporates a broader infrastructure mindset by linking licensing status with operational access conditions. The effect is that licensed payment service providers, whether MPIs or SPIs, operate within a unified statutory regime that contemplates both conduct and connectivity, even if the statute stops short of an explicit API mandate. This hybrid model contrasts with South Africa's provider plus conduct approach and positions Singapore as an intermediary between sectoral and competition driven access regime. So we have lesson for South Africa in this regard is that the regulatory approaches examined above demonstrate that different legal mechanisms may be used to address barriers to participation, access, and interoperability within payment systems. The PSD2 framework demonstrates the use of statutory obligations to regulate third-party access to payment account services and payment initiation, while the UK Open Banking Initiative illustrates how competition law intervention may be used to promote standardization and customer permission data sharing through common technical interfaces. Singapore's PSA, in turn, provides an example of a statutory licensing framework that expressly regulates cross-border money transfer services and subjects providers to regulatory oversight. So these approaches provide different lessons for the South African legal framework. In particular, they raise questions concerning whether South African law provides sufficient legal certainty regarding the participation of cross-border payment services providers and the interaction with domestic payment service providers and their access to payment system infrastructure. The approaches also demonstrate that legal mechanisms concerning authorization, access, standardization, technical interoperability, and regulatory oversight may operate together to facilitate the functioning of payment services. These considerations are particularly relevant in light of the South African Reserve Bank's identification of proprietary APIs and non-standardized payment messages as barriers to third-party integration and technical interoperability. The EU, UK, and Singapore legal frameworks therefore provide useful reference points for assessing whether the South African legal framework adequately addresses the legal and regulatory challenges associated with cross-border payment interoperability within the national payment system, and whether elements of these approaches may inform its future development. Wow, not even 120. Okay. PSD2. What? Oh my God. Oh no. Oh. What does South Africa learn? South Africa must adopt PSD2. Oh my God. My brain is no longer functioning. Wow. We have each jurisdiction teaches, of course, different lesson. Of course, every jurisdiction you choose does something that arguably does not do as clearly. You clearly defines who may access payment accounts and under what legal conditions. UK clearly defines how banks and third parties must interact through standardized interfaces. Singapore clearly defines who may provide cross-border payment services and under what license. The South African law provides the same level of legal certainty regarding the legal certainty